In the Studio is sponsored this week by Iowa and by Sudafed Cough and Cold.
Doc, you did some time to catch Jeff on the left hand. You didn't like the way your hand was this morning.
Excuse me, is this thing on?
Whoa.
Yeah.
Excuse me.
You're welcome.
Guitar up.
1,
Turn
2,
that guitar
3.
up.
Hi, and welcome to In the Studio. I'm Redbeard, bringing you the stories behind the greatest rock albums in history. Today, we're in the studio for the first of our two-part focus on 1994's Album of the Year.
The intention of this album was to try and recreate a band feeling. Both Dave and Nick, I can speak for them, I think, and myself, really liked the feeling we had on Dark Side of the Moon and Wish You Were Here.
And this album, I guess I'd say for the first time since maybe the Wish You Were Here album, is a more joint effort than any album we've done since then.
What do you want from me?
There will always be people who feel that Pink Floyd finished when Roger left, just as there are people who feel Pink Floyd ended when Syd Barrett left. And you can't change that. For them, that is the case. And much as I would love to be able to sort of convince them otherwise, I understand that that's the case.
What do you want from me?
Hello, I'm David Gilmour.
Hello, I'm Richard Wright.
And I'm Nick Mason of Pink Floyd, and you're listening to The Division Bell on the Album Network.
To say that 1994 has been a very good year for Pink Floyd is an understatement. On the concert side, Pink Floyd put together one of the biggest traveling road shows in the world, and for 6 months they amazed, dazzled, and awed rock audiences from San Diego to Prague, Czechoslovakia, with their unprecedented sound, light, and staging spectacular. The Boston Globe called the show, and we quote, "a feast for the mind and the senses." All in all, over 5 million people witnessed firsthand Pink Floyd in concert. The phenomenon began in February when a psychedelic painted blimp began flying across the United States. And when it landed at the Rose Bowl in Pasadena, the announcement became official. Not only was a huge tour in the works, but Pink Floyd's first studio album in 7 years, called The Division Bell, was about to be released. Musically, The Division Bell features a perfect blend of melodic acoustic-driven ballads, majestic instrumentals, high drama, and plenty of the band's exquisitely atmospheric ensemble playing. Lyrically, The Division Bell by Pink Floyd is a sophisticated meditation on what happens when human beings fail to communicate, the inevitable isolation of individual consciousness, the inexhaustible desire for communion, and finally, the very real possibility of transcendence brought on by shimmering moments of grace. I mean, we're pretty far from sex, drugs, and rock and roll here, folks. As complex, though, as it sounds, all of this great music couldn't have been created had it not been for the hugely successful Momentary Lapse of Reason tour in 1987, which reunited David Gilmour, Nick Mason, and this gentleman, keyboardist Richard Wright of Pink Floyd. What was the feeling when you came at the conclusion of the Momentary Lapse tour? What was said, what was left unsaid about the future?
I don't think there was any clear idea of the future, except that everyone realized the band had started happening again. And there was a lot of sadness.
Why? What kind
At
of
the end of
sadness?
the tour.
Oh.
Parting? And that last tour had a wonderful feeling to it that we hadn't had for years. Because I've done every Pink Floyd tour. And certainly for me, I had probably the best feeling of the band being together since the beginning, virtually. So I knew it was going to happen again. There was no way that after the feeling that we had in that tour that Dave or Nick would say, not again.
Echoing his feelings at the end of Pink Floyd's 1987-88 Momentary Lapse of Reason tour is Pink Floyd drummer Nick Mason.
I think the most important thing to say from my point of view about the Momentary Lapse tour was I had a wonderful time. And the thing that we got from that was to go out and work long and hard enough to actually develop something to the point where you could say it's right. All the touring we ever did through all the 70s and 80s, we never ever did enough. So the shows were always half developed. We could never put, with the exception of The Wall, where because it was to be filmed, we were able really to throw everything at it and do it properly. But we still never played it as well as we would have done if we'd done it for, let's say, at least 3 months.
Did you have a sense of accomplishment, a sense of self-satisfaction, any sense of permanently quieting any detractors who questioned the authenticity of a Pink Floyd project like Momentary Lapse? Did you find that success is the sweetest revenge?
Not really. Success doesn't actually alleviate. It doesn't alleviate criticism. Unfortunately, there is no direct. That would be a wonderful thing if criticism was cancelled out by success. Unfortunately, that is not the case. I think, however successful you are, however long you've been doing it, most performers actually can be cut to the quick by criticism, and can quite often. I think critics sometimes underestimate how hurtful and how easily they can actually cut through.
Why do you think we concentrate on the one that got away? That doesn't love us for that moment.
Well, absolutely, Doctor. I mean, that's it. That the reason we're all up there is this desperate desire to show off and please people and perform. And so, consequently, the one that does get away is the one that sort of gets through to your conscience or to your psyche or whatever. Not conscience, really, but is the one that disturbs you because you are always yourself a little uneasy about it, about whether you've really got it
uncertain,
right.
Yeah.
And if I was writing critique on the band, there are always things that I pick up on and things that aren't quite right, or that perhaps philosophically are wrong. I mean, it's we inhabit a rather curious sort of area of rock music, where what we do is sort of slightly off. It's slightly off the beaten track in a way, which in some ways is terrific, and in other ways is sort of curious. And I think for some people, there are always people who are going to find what we do a sort of, I suppose you could almost say, unnatural, and it will never work for them because it in some ways goes against the rules of rock and roll, and about how real rock music should be, which maybe it should be in a bar somewhere, or it should be where you can see the sweat on everyone, or you have personalities, or whatever.
But I thought it was about also breaking rules, and that's just it. See, these are self-imposed rules, and the first thing, one of the things that we all love about Pink Floyd is that the first thing that goes is the rules.
Yeah.
The boundaries that restrict thought and imagination is the first thing that you throw out.
Well, yes, but I mean, there are all sorts of rules, aren't there? That some are spoken, some are unspoken, and some are complete nonsense, but that we all sort of allow to sort of roll along.
That's
I mean,
we allow it.
There will always be people who feel that Pink Floyd finished when Roger left, just as there are people who feel Pink Floyd ended when Sid Barrett left. And you can't change that. For them, that is the case. And much as I would love to be able to sort of convince them otherwise, I understand that that's the case. There's also a sort of concept that bands have to be people would like to believe that they are made up of sort of groups of lovable mop-tops. It's the sort of the Beatles as they were in 1967. That's really our sort of ideal view of a band. And of course it's not true. This goes back to the elements that make up a band. Generally, there's an enormous amount of conflict and tension in a band. It's considered, when it's reported, it's considered to be scandal almost. But it's something that is allowed to drift on as a sort of concept of how rock music should be. But of course, it's complete nonsense.
Following the momentary lapse of reason tour of 87 and 88, the affirmation that Pink Floyd was once again a band also had a positive effect on guitarist and vocalist David Gilmour.
Right upon release of Momentary Lapse, Roger had taken his vendetta from the courts to the press, and he was lobbing verbal mortars at you publicly. You were, at that point, really kind of under a siege mentality, because the Momentary Lapse album and the tour had really, they weren't the documented success that we now know them to be. And the press was allowing itself to be manipulated into being the messenger boy. But 60 sold-out stadium shows later, and 4 million Momentary Lapse albums later or more. When I saw you 9 months later at the conclusion of that tour, you were confident, you were jovial, you were self-satisfied.
Too self-satisfied, maybe.
Well,
maybe too self-satisfied.
Why do you say that? Isn't success the best revenge?
Yes, I mean, I don't know how interested I am in revenge. It's, you know, it's a long, painful process which was trying to deprive me of my liberty to do what I wanted to do, and I don't really react terribly well to that. Lurching into the future, bearing the mantle of Pink Floyd without Roger in 1987 was a tough one. It's as anyone can imagine. It's a big, tough mantle to stick on my poor shoulders and trudge forward into the future with.
I don't know if I've ever heard you verbalize it that way.
Well, it is. It's tough, and you're right to say that I was confident at the end and happy. Anyone would be happy and confident at the end when our moving forward and doing what we did, making the album, doing that tour, was justified. One can consider the merits of everyone's case in these things, but I don't think there's many people that wouldn't have thought at that point that we had every right to continue doing what we were doing.
I'm Nick Mason of Pink Floyd, and you're listening to The Division Bell on the Album Network.
Thanks, Nick. I'm Red Beard, and this is 1994's Album of the Year, The Division Bell. Like its predecessor, Momentary Lapse of Reason, The Division Bell was also recorded on David Gilmour's houseboat on the River Thames in London. According to drummer Nick Mason, simply beginning was one of the hardest things about this album.
It's very hard to get the thing started because there is an inevitability that it will be a long project, and that's a problem because it's difficult to start work. I'm sure we'd all agree we make records because we want to make records. It's not some contractual obligation. It's not something that at the end of the day that sort of has to be done. It's something that we want to do, but inevitably, you know, you're sort of lining up for spending the entire year working on this record, and no matter how much you would like to be able to do it in 2 months or 3 months, you know it's going to take a long time. So it's really useful to have someone there to help push it along a bit. I think the curious thing is that you can all sit around and talk about being radical or changing things or sort of trying to do things in a different way, but of course the length of time you've been at it means that the tunnel narrows in a way that inevitably what appears radical to you after 20 years is in fact very narrow band compared to how you might have behaved 20 years before. Hindsight is an exact science. I don't think that I see particular continuity to our working life, if you like. I think it's interesting that there are records that sort of come that you could actually take groups of our recording history and say there's more continuity between, let's say Dark Side and The Wall than the albums between. And I think perhaps with the newest record, it goes back to perhaps Wish You Were Here or something like that. There are jumps, but I mean that's inevitable from having more or less the same group of people working together for a long time.
Okay, let's talk about that. Is that an accident that the same group of people have worked together for this length of time? I mean, you've outlived marriages, you've watched kids grow up, you've watched walls being built and then being torn down almost in the lifetime of this band.
Yep, the whole of European history has sort of passed us by while we've been in the recording studio. and new view of world order. The general, I would have said the general rule of thumb is that the reason why a band stay together is because the sum is greater than the parts. That as long as the band feel, and all the members of the band feel, that they can achieve more together than they can on their own, there is a purpose to the band remaining together. And the reason why people leave bands is because they no longer believe that to be the case. Certainly in the case of someone like Roger, he wanted to go and do it on his own. That's the more interesting thing is perhaps how bands actually get together in the first place, which does seem to be entirely a matter of luck.
We continue our conversation now with Pink Floyd's David Gilmour.
How has the writing and recording for The Division Bell differed from the way the band created the last 5 studio albums?
Well, you know the history. It's in the last few years we've been through all our sort of ups and downs, our splits and all that stuff. Rick left, rejoined, Roger left, didn't rejoin. The album since, say, Animals was more an album where Roger and I were taking command of it, and it was becoming more down to things that were written at home by people. The Wall even more so. The Momentary Lapse of Reason album was recorded again by... It wasn't a terribly cooperative event with everyone really putting their maximum in. And this album, I guess I'd say for the first time since maybe the Wish You Were Here album, is a more joint effort than any album we've done since then, which we started off by going into Nick's studio, Britannia Row studio in London, January 93, with myself, Rick, and Nick, and Guy, the bass player from our last tour, and we just jammed away at anything for 2 weeks, just playing anything that we had in our heads or that we made up on the spot. And then we took all that over to Astoria and started listening to all the tapes and working stuff out. We found we had 65 pieces of music.
There must be a different attitude towards creative process now.
Well, if you look at the albums, if you look at the things, I think of my favorite album, I suppose I would say, was the Wish You Were Here album. And the actual process of sitting together in a room with several musicians and actually performing together from nothing is a very interesting, exciting sort of process. And rather than coming into the studio with pieces of music that I already had and pieces of music that Rick already had and stuff like that, and music from anywhere, I thought that it would be better for us to start off from scratch with nothing and just go and start jamming. Whether or not we would keep all that stuff or whether we'd use any of it or what was not really particularly relevant, but just to start that process off. And in fact, we didn't use, several of the tracks are sort of my own songs that didn't even come from that period and have been written since or whatever. It doesn't really matter, but that process was a very, very good, if you like, communal process where we all contributed together, and that was what started the album off. It gave us our kickstart. So the start of the album came from a more joint effort than any album that we've made since Wish You Were Here. Hello, I'm David Gilmour.
Hello, I'm Richard Wright.
And I'm Nick Mason of Pink Floyd, and you're listening to The Division Bell on the Album Network.
And I'm Redbeard. Let's continue our look at the making of this fantastic album of the year for 1994, The Division Bell by Pink Floyd. Let's continue with David Gilmour.
First of all, the title, The Division Bell. Was the title actually something that came late, or is it just something that you kept under your hat?
Late isn't. It's one of the very, very last things that we did. I think it was the last thing that we did on the album, was getting the damn title. We took ages. It comes from a line in a song, High Hopes, contains a line about the Division Bell.
What is the Division Bell?
The Division Bell is a bell that rings in Westminster, in the Houses of Parliament, and it also rings in the apartments of many of the members of Parliament, and it is a bell that rings to summon all the members of Parliament to go to the House of Commons and to divide into yeas and nays to vote on the issues because often in debates in the Houses of Parliament, the members of Parliament are not necessarily all there. Some of them have already made up their minds about what they want to do, or are just going to follow the party line. And so they may be sitting at home in an apartment. There's a sort of catchment area around the Houses of Parliament where, within a certain distance, where if you are a member of Parliament, they install this bell in your apartment. They get to the point where they finish debating, they ring this bell. Everyone that's in the area comes down. If you're all the Tories and all the Labour people, all come down to vote one way or the other. It's a division bell. It divides the yeses from the nos.
Pink Floyd began recording the Division Bell album in January of 1993, but they'd already committed to begin touring in March of 94. Now, while this self-imposed time schedule gave them at least a year to finish the record, it also put Pink Floyd under a great deal of pressure to satisfy their artistic vision relatively quickly. Again, David Gilmour.
Well, the pressure to get our artistic thing right obviously is very intense, but that is sort of more in the early stages of the recording process, when there seemed to be an awful lot of time, because we actually started it in January of 93. So we did have, I mean, by most people's standard, one would think we had plenty of time. And a lot of the artistic stuff anyway is kind of semi-decided quite a long way in advance of completion, but then there's an awful lot of trial and error, experimentation and donkey work to get done to actually get the thing finished. And it's very, very easy to miscalculate how long you've got to spend on each thing. But that said, we did get it done. It took a lot of hours and stuff, and it's we're all incredibly pleased with it.
I'm wondering, why are you showing so much of yourself on the Division Bell and letting us into a place that I don't think you've ever let us into before?
I suppose really the first album that I was in charge of, and I was having, that I could have done that on, was the Momentary Lapse of Reason album. When I was sort of entering a really difficult personal phase, but didn't want to get into it, and didn't want that to get into the record particularly, I guess. I don't really know. Right now, I'm in a much better personal state than I was at that time. Very happy in my life, and not unhappy to sort of let it seep through into some of the music. You have to do what you feel is the right thing to do at any one given moment, and if you may not have the reasons for it firm up against the front of your mind, but these felt like the things that I wanted to put into the music, and some of them just come about accidentally. You start off with a little piece of music and something comes to mind, and you think, yeah, and you start exploring it, and it takes its own volition, and the only decision you really have to make is whether you are brave enough to actually leave it there like that, not change it, not disguise it over much.
There's the risk.
Yeah, I don't feel that there's, I don't think there's any great risk in the stuff that we recorded on here. I don't feel so exposed by it. I mean, there are aspects of me that I expose in it, I suppose, that I'm very happy to expose. I don't have any great problem with exposing it.
That's called Take It Back from Pink Floyd's The Division Bell, the Album Network's 1994 Album of the Year. I'm Redbeard. David Gilmour, Nick Mason, and Richard Wright of Pink Floyd are our guests this week in the studio. We'll be right back with more after this.
What has changed with you, Rick and David, that allows you to create music this way?
It was a moment when we did review really how other albums had been done and what we liked in past albums and what we'd like to do again and find. What I particularly wanted on this record was for it to be much more a played record and played by the band rather than bringing people in to augment it and help do it and so on. At least the sort of basic ideas are all designed and therefore playable by the principals.
The rain fell slow down on all the roofs of uncertain
The Division Bell. That's Pink Floyd with a song called Poles Apart. Our exclusive interview with Pink Floyd on the making of The Division Bell continues with David Gilmour.
If one of your goals was to create an environment for the listener listening to The Division Bell, you've succeeded remarkably. It's kind of magic, really.
Well, that's what we're trying to create, simply magic. It's as simple as that. Try to create magic, try to move people, move their hearts a little bit. I have already had vast amounts of enjoyment out of this record myself, and I sit at home late at night and listen to it through in all the stages it's been through, just a collection of songs, collection of tracks without words, collection of tracks with words, with melodies, without melodies, all the way through. I get home from the studio and I listen through to the progress that we've made. And as soon as we had, a collection of pieces, a few months ago we had a collection of pieces. I had a tape over an hour long, with basically pretty much all the tracks on it. And I'd sit at home late at night after returning from the studio and listen to them, and I really have got off on it myself, enjoyed it so much. You then just keep honing away at it, working those things to try and make them even better, make them have more point, make them have more poignancy, if you like, more heart. And you can then only hope when you deliver it out that the pleasure that you've had will be shared by other people. I know nothing pleases everyone, but there will be people who will listen to this, who will derive the same sort of pleasure that I have out of it, and that is something that makes me feel very good about this particular record.
It should.
The trouble with making records really is that you do tend to finish the record and then go out and do a tour, and you're so busy playing the tour, playing all the songs and doing stuff, that you never listen to the record again. I mean, usually from the date of release of the record, that's about the last time I get to listen to the record for God knows how long, maybe a year or more. And then it can be very, very enjoyable, really good fun to actually not have listened to it for a long period of time and just sit at home, relax with a glass of wine, and listen to the record for the first time for a long time. And yeah, so I'm looking forward to that. The end of this year, maybe.
Is it ever disconcerting to let it go from that special place where you created it? You've lived with it intimately. You've been the birth mother for this project. Is there ever a point at which you've got to let it go? It's kind of like sending your child off to school for the first time?
It is like that, yes. You do have to let it go, and you always think there was more that you could have and should have done, and you always kind of want a little bit more time to get the thing finished and to the perfection that you imagine. And everyone knows about records in the past. Neil Young, I remember once, put a record out, actually released it, then recorded it, and then remixed it and reworked it for months, and then put it out again, and then record it again, I think. You've all heard about these things. I wouldn't want to take it that far, but you always think there's a little bit more that you could have done.
Pink Floyd and the achingly beautiful instrumental featuring Rick Wright on piano and the plaintive guitar of David Gilmour. Once known by the band members as the Whale piece, that song is actually called Marooned. I'm Redbeard. Coming up next, David Gilmour reflects on the first time he heard the song Keep Talking on the radio. Plus, a rare chat with Pink Floyd keyboardist Richard Wright when we return in the studio for part 2 of The Division Bell.
Hello, I'm David Gilmour of Pink Floyd, and you're listening to The Division Bell on the Album Network.
And I'm Redbeard. The first peel of The Division Bell in March '94 was the intriguing song Keep Talking. Pink Floyd's David Gilmour remembers hearing it on the radio for the first time.
It's always quite extraordinary when you hear one of your things that you've been working on for ages, and you know what it means, you know everything about it, but the first time you hear it on the radio, you have got the added weight of knowing that there are millions of other people listening to it as well. So you get a completely different perspective on it.
It's also, for you, it's out of context, isn't it?
It's not so much the out of context. It's that you know that other people are listening, and it's their first listen. And things are, every bit of it, you sort of gets invested with a different meaning, if you like. And it was really, really nice to hear that this morning on the radio, and wonder how people would take to hearing this strange voice talking about for millions of years and stuff on the beginning of it. It's really, really... There are some aspects to making records and making music that you just never yourself get. Some of the things that are in the stuff you have done until you hear it yourself on the radio with the knowledge that millions of other people, millions of other ears are listening at the same time. It's fascinating.
Who is that voice?
Well, it's not a real voice. It's the voice of Stephen Hawking, who is the professor who wrote this book called A Brief History of Time. It's a huge, huge popular book. He's suffering from motor neurone disease. He's in a wheelchair. He can't speak. And this is a voice synthesizer computer thing that has been built for him. I think he can only move one finger, a tiny, tiny little bit, and he works it all with that. I saw an advert on the television in England for a telephone company, and his voice was on this advertisement. And this advertisement nearly made me weep. I've never had that with a television advertisement or with a commercial on the television. As I don't suppose you have. I don't think I know anyone else who's ever. But this is the most powerful piece of television advertising that I've ever seen in my life, and I thought it was fascinating. And I contacted the company that made it and asked if I could borrow the voice track from it, this voiceover track from it, which I did, which is this voice synthesizer thing, and I applied it to one of the pieces of music we already had, and had fiddled around with it for months, changing it and putting, until it started making sense.
Now, was this your first awareness of Stephen Hawking?
Oh, no. I've known about him for years. He's incredibly well-known. His book, A Brief History of Time, was all about black holes and stuff. It's one of the biggest-selling sort of scientific-type books ever. He's a very, very successful person, but he can't talk or move or anything.
Now, what do you know about him personally? How? I mean, he is like preeminent scientist, is he not?
He is, yeah. They got him to do this advert for a telephone company in England, and I don't think he even wrote the words that they used with him, but they used him in the advert. I mean, he was in it in his wheelchair. He looks kind of strange. And I just found it so moving that I felt that I had to try and do something with it, or with him, or something in some way. I suppose you could say that there's a theme throughout the album which involves communication, and pretty much all the songs are connected to the theme of communication in some way or another.
Featuring the synthesized voice of renowned astrophysicist Stephen Hawking. That's Pink Floyd with Keep Talking, one of 5 songs that keyboardist Rick Wright co-wrote on the Division Bell. I asked Pink Floyd drummer Nick Mason to comment on Wright's musical contribution to this album.
The sound is quite often, it's not necessarily only to do with what the solo instruments are. It is to do with an overall sound, and Rick's contribution at that level is immeasurable, and you forget it until you hear it. And he's an extraordinary character anyway, because a lot of what he does is totally natural. I mean, if you ask him to if you explain what you want, he might have some difficulty with it. If you just leave him to do it, it just comes straight out. But there are certainly bits and pieces on the record that were done by simply leaving Rick in the room with the tape recorder running, and just while he just played, and it was a bit like panning for gold. You could then take this stuff and shake it, and there were the golden nuggets.
I asked Pink Floyd's Richard Wright in what ways making the Division Bell album was satisfying to him.
It was fulfilling because I wrote on it. And I wrote with Dave on it. And I sang on it for the first time a lead vocal since Dark Side of the Moon. So that was very fulfilling.
Good.
Because you see, I have to say, I've never ever had any confidence in my voice.
Okay.
And but I wrote this song, Wearing the Inside Out, and so I had to sing it, and it was quite interesting because I hadn't really sung, and went in and did a track of singing it. I'd rehearsed it with Anthony Moore, who wrote the lyrics, but I basically hadn't really sung for 20 years. And did one take, and Bob Evans said, "Okay, that's it," which I couldn't believe. And went in and listened to it, and I said, yes, it is nearly it. And we worked on it a bit. But it's a song that really suits my voice. I don't have a versatile voice, okay? I'm not a Dave. There are certain ways of singing I can do, like the choruses of Time, Us and Them, or the chorus of Time. I have a voice that can do certain ways of singing, and Wearing the Inside Out, because I wrote it, would suit my voice. I couldn't sing Money, for example.
Hello, I'm David Gilmour.
Hello, I'm Richard Wright.
And I'm Nick Mason of Pink Floyd, and you're listening to The Division Bell on the Album Network.
And I'm Redbeard. Welcome back. One of the elements that has always proved to be an equal complement to the music of Pink Floyd is the creative artwork, the graphics, the videos that accompany each release. One of the individuals who has been most responsible for the album artwork over the years is Storm Thorgerson. Here's drummer Nick Mason of Pink Floyd.
Well, I think one of the best things about working with Storm is that he knows us very well. And I think that probably gives us an awful lot of shorthand. He has a pretty good idea of what won't interest us and what will. So that immediately scraps 70% of the sort of waste that might occur if you were trying to deal with ideas that actually won't work or won't work for us. And he's become very good at, I think, presenting ideas, the initial ideas, in a very rough form. That's another thing that works well, so that you're not always working things up to a final version and then dismissing them. You can take a rough idea and then develop it and keep an eye on it and keep things sort of coming off it and flowing and so on. I think that's probably the sort of strongest thing we have going for us in terms of getting a number of things to come up together. It's also, I think, that Storm is very much an ideas man rather than specifically one type of artist, which means that you're not always looking for someone to promote perhaps particularly photography rather than painting, rather than some sort of computer graphic element. He's very open to any particular form of thing, so that it's very easy to cast around and look at any number of visual ideas and examine them rather than concentrating on one particular flow. I mean, an example, and this is in no way a criticism, would be to remember someone like Yes and the Roger Dean. I mean, it was very nice in a way because it created a very specific image and so on, but it did tend to get locked into one particular style of graphics. I think probably graphically we're more radical than we are musically.
The song that closes out the Division Bell album is an epic called High Hopes. Here's David Gilmour of Pink Floyd.
High Hopes was really the last one. It was written after all the others were sort of in some form or other. I think I wrote it in July or something. It was very, very quick. It's one of those ones that works quickly but beautifully almost immediately, and I came up with a tiny bit of music, just had it on a cassette, just a few bars of piano, and then I went off to get away to a small house somewhere with my girlfriend, Polly, and try and make some progress on lyric writing. And she gave me a phrase about something about before time wears you down, and I took it from there and got stuck into a whole sort of thing about, I suppose, it's autobiographical, really, I suppose I'd have to say on that one. It's about my life, Cambridge life, my childhood, I suppose. Yeah, we came up with it very, very quickly. We wrote the words to it, most of the words to it in a day. And then I went back to the studio with no one else there the minute I got back and put a demo down of it. Did everything myself on it, and it was virtually complete in a day.
Everything about Pink Floyd has always been exaggerated.
You know, you make a record, and the record you do to suit yourself, but you hope that people will sit at home and listen to it in a certain environment, which is personal, and they will devote their energy to listening to it in a way, and they will get out of it a lot of good out of it. They'll be moved by it, hopefully. When you take a show out, it's a slightly different proposition. In what way? You can't. There's 50, 60,000 people out there in front of you. You can't do it the same way. You have to attempt to entertain in a slightly different way than you are with a record.
And by definition, it's a coming together. It's a communal thing where maybe consuming this is a very personal thing, as you said. Yeah.
And so we do consider ourselves to be serious at the work we do and serious musicians in some sort of way. But on the road doing big concerts, I also think we have a responsibility to make it entertaining and fun for a large crowd of people. You can't. It's not a small theatre. It's not a sort of intimacies that you can do in the small theatre which you can't do in this. And there are things you can do in this large environment that you can't do in a small theatre. And you have to gear it for the place that you're going to and the amount of people that want to see you.
A live version of Astronomy Domine, originally on Pink Floyd's first album. It was the opening song on the opening night of Pink Floyd's 1994 tour. That performance at Joe Robbie Stadium in Miami. That's a little something extra for you as we conclude our two-part focus on Pink Floyd's The Division Bell.